I was sitting quietly at the round table in the middle of the grand ballroom right beside my 7-year-old grandson, Ethan. The air shimmered with golden light from hundreds of candles, and the murmur of conversations blended with the soft jazz drifting from the corner stage. Crystal glasses clinked, white roses glowed under chandeliers, and for most of the guests this was a night of joy. But for me something felt strangely heavy, like a storm brewing beneath the polished surface of celebration. It was my son Daniel's second wedding. He looked handsome in his navy blue suit, moving gracefully from table to table, shaking hands and raising his glass with that wide smile he had learned to wear even when his heart was scarred. His bride, Vanessa, was dazzling in a gown stitched with thousands of glittering beads. She laughed easily, posed for photographs as if the cameras existed just for her, and moved with the confidence of someone who believed the night was hers alone. I wanted to believe she could give Daniel a fresh start, but my chest tightened every time I looked at her. Ethan sat at my side, his small red toy car rolling back and forth across the immaculate tablecloth. He was quiet, withdrawn into a little world of his own where he could escape the chaos of adults. I reached out, straightened his tiny bow tie, and pressed my hand gently against his hair. In his round face I saw echoes of his late mother, Clara, whose memory never left me. Clara's warmth had filled our lives once, but fate had stolen her away too soon, leaving behind wounds that no smile could heal. The waiter poured more wine into my glass. I nodded politely but didn't drink. I kept watching Ethan. When I cut a small piece of cake for him, he lifted his eyes with gratitude before lowering them again, returning to the safe rhythm of his toy. His silence was unusual. Normally he would talk endlessly about school, about the sparrows in our backyard, or about the kites he wanted to fly. Tonight he was tense, his little shoulders rigid. Then it happened. Ethan froze. His hand stopped moving the car, his face drained of color. He grabbed my wrist with fingers that felt like ice. His voice trembled as he leaned close and whispered, "Grandma, I want to leave right now." My heart lurched. I bent toward him, trying to soothe him. "What's wrong, my love? Tell me." But he pressed his lips together, shivering as though the words themselves were dangerous. After a long pause, he whispered again, barely audible. "Grandma, you didn't look under the table, did you?" The sentence was like a blade piercing straight through me. My breathing faltered, the jazz music faded into silence inside my head, and every laugh around us turned hollow. Ethan's terrified eyes were locked on mine, begging me not to ignore him. I stroked his hair to calm him, though my own heart pounded violently. With trembling hands, I lifted the white tablecloth and peered into the shadows beneath, the polished chair legs, Ethan's small shoes, and darkness. But there, beside his chair, lay something small, a folded piece of paper. At first glance it seemed harmless, but the way Ethan pressed against me told me otherwise. I bent lower, picked it up with fingers that shook, and unfolded it slowly in the candlelight. 5 words hurriedly scribbled stared back at me like a curse. Table 12, add shrimp to the child's serving. My stomach turned to stone. Ethan was dangerously allergic to shrimp. Everyone close to our family knew it. One careless bite could close his throat, could send him into shock. And here at his father's wedding, someone had planned for that very thing. I clutched the note in my hand, crumpling it as waves of fury and fear crashed over me. The laughter in the hall, the clinking of glasses, the glitter of chandeliers, all of it blurred into a mocking haze. The boy I loved more than life itself was in the middle of a trap. Who could be so cruel? Who would want to destroy a child on a day meant to celebrate love? Ethan buried his face against my arm, shivering. I wrapped him close, forcing myself to stay upright while my insides collapsed. Across the room, Daniel laughed with his friends, his arm around Vanessa's waist. She sparkled like a jewel under the lights, smiling as though nothing in the world could shake her. But I saw something else in her eyes, for just a flicker, a tightness, a flash of calculation. It could have been nothing. Or it could have been everything. The music swelled and waiters began preparing for the main course. My breath came shallow and ragged. Every plate carried a potential death sentence if that note reached the kitchen. I pressed the crumpled paper to my chest, my decision already forming. I couldn't let a single bite reach Ethan's lips. Not tonight. Not ever. I leaned close to my grandson and whispered, "Stay with me, my love. I won't let anything happen to you." He nodded silently, his eyes wide and wet. I knew then that the night of celebration had turned into a battlefield, and I was the only one who could defend him. The chandeliers blazed brighter as if mocking me, and the laughter of the guests rose again oblivious to the storm. I looked once more at the bride who raised her glass high with a smile that was far too perfect, and for the first time I wondered if beneath that smile there was darkness deep enough to kill. The evening had only just begun, and already the mask of happiness was cracking. The crumpled paper burned against my palm as if it carried fire. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to breathe to keep Ethan steady. For a moment I closed my eyes, and in the swirl of candlelight and music another time rose before me. A gentler time when my family was whole. I could see Clara's face as clearly as if she were standing before me. She had a smile that could soften even the heaviest heart. When Daniel first brought her home, I remember thinking how rare it was to meet someone so kind, so quietly luminous. She never needed to raise her voice, never needed to demand attention. Simply being near her was like standing in sunlight. Their home in the suburbs was modest, with paint peeling on the shutters and a small yard out back where sparrows gathered every morning. Clara filled it with life. She grew herbs in pots along the porch, hung bright curtains in the kitchen, and laughed easily at Daniel's clumsy jokes. And when Ethan came along, she became even more radiant. I remember arriving one afternoon to find her crouched in the grass with a basket of vegetables from her garden. Ethan, barely old enough to walk, toddled after a red rubber ball that rolled across the yard. His giggles echoed in the summer air, and Clara's eyes followed him with pure adoration. She waved me over and pressed a bowl of chili into my hands, eager for my opinion. "Tell me what you think," she said, her voice tinged with pride. I ate, and she leaned forward like a girl waiting for praise, though she was already a woman carrying the weight of a young family. Those were the days I believed happiness would last forever. Even during hardships, Clara had a way of making us feel we were strong enough. When Ethan grew feverish one winter night, his little body burning, Clara held him close, tears sliding down her cheeks. She whispered, "I'm so scared," in a trembling voice. I sat beside her, cooling Ethan's forehead with damp cloths. "He's strong," I told her, though inside I was as terrified as she was. We stayed up until dawn, watching anxiously until his fever broke. When his breathing steadied, Clara gave me a smile, fragile but glowing, and whispered, "Thank you. I couldn't have done it without you." That moment etched itself into my soul. But no one can shield a family from fate forever. It was a spring afternoon when the phone rang. I was in the kitchen rinsing dishes when a voice I'll never forget announced itself. A police officer. The words struck like thunder. "Accident, highway truck lost control." I dropped a plate, heard it shatter across the floor, but felt nothing except a ringing in my ears. Clara was gone before help arrived. The funeral came under torrential rain. Umbrellas bent under the wind and mourners whispered in the gray downpour. Ethan, only 4, clung to me with wide, bewildered eyes. "Where's Mommy?" he asked, his small voice piercing me deeper than any knife. I pressed him against me, whispering, "She's in a beautiful place, my love, though." Inside I shattered piece by piece. Daniel was broken too. He stood at the coffin's shoulders, trembling, unable to speak. His eyes were hollow, as though part of his soul had been buried with Clara. After that day he changed. He drowned himself in work, leaving early and returning late, always trying to outrun grief. But grief is not a thing you can outrun. Ethan suffered most of all. He grew quiet, retreating into himself, sometimes staring out windows as if waiting for someone who would never return. At night he would ask me, "Grandma, tell me a story about Mommy." I would swallow the lump in my throat and tell him about the way Clara sang lullabies, how she cut fruit into little pieces just for him, how her laughter sounded like bells. I wanted him to remember her warmth, even if memory was all he had left. During those years, another blessing helped keep us afloat. My adopted daughter Grace became a steady presence. She had always been bright, with a heart full of tenderness. She treated Ethan like a little brother, bringing him coloring books, teaching him to read, or simply sitting beside him while he drew crooked houses and cars. She praised every effort, making him beam with pride. I often caught her glancing at Daniel too, her eyes carrying something deeper than mere sibling affection, though I never spoke of it. The fragile balance of our household depended on silence. Our home no longer rang with constant laughter, but thanks to Grace and Ethan, a flame still flickered. I did everything I could to keep it alive. Even as Daniel grew distant, even as my heart ached every time Ethan asked for a mother who could no longer come, we carried on. The memory of Clara lingered in every corner. in the scent of herbs still growing in the yard, in Ethan's small face that mirrored hers so perfectly in the silence that followed every dinner. It was a silence I thought would last forever until the day Daniel arrived with someone new. Her name was Vanessa. I can still recall the moment she stepped through my doorway, her hair falling in perfect waves, her lips painted a practiced shade of red. She wore a pale blue dress that seemed designed to impress, and when she extended her hand, her smile looked rehearsed, as though she'd practiced it in the mirror until it fit just right. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Harris," she said warmly, setting her gaze on me. I invited her in, trying to open my heart, trying to believe my son deserved a second chance at love. I poured her coffee, listened as she praised my home. But when her eyes lingered too long on the framed photo of Clara holding baby Ethan, a chill crept through me. Something in that gaze didn't feel like empathy. It felt like calculation. Dinner that evening was filled with Daniel's enthusiasm with Vanessa's flawless charm. Yet Ethan barely touched his food. He kept his head down, avoiding her eyes, his little hands clenched around his fork. When Vanessa slid a chocolate bar across the table toward him, cooing, "This is for you," he didn't move. He turned his face away, fear flickering in his eyes. Daniel frowned, about to scold him, but I cut in quickly. "He's tired," I said, but deep inside unease took root. It was small, almost invisible, but it was there. And as time passed, it grew. The weeks that followed were filled with little moments that should have reassured me, but instead unsettled me further. Vanessa made herself present in our lives with surprising ease, showing up with bright smiles and gestures of generosity. She offered to help with the dishes, complimented my cooking, even brought small gifts for Ethan. On the surface, she was everything a grieving family might need, but beneath that surface I caught glimpses of something sharp. One Saturday morning she appeared at the door, her voice ringing with cheer. "I'd love to take Ethan to the park today," she announced, her eyes sparkling, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Daniel had gone into the office, buried once again in endless work, and I hesitated. A walk in the sun should have been harmless. But when I looked at Ethan crouched on the living room floor with his toy blocks, his face was unreadable. "Of course," I said after a pause, forcing a smile. "Fresh air will do him good." Vanessa beamed and took Ethan's hand. He didn't resist, but his small body was rigid as she led him out the door. I watched from the window as she walked him down the path, and unease tugged at me like a thread I couldn't ignore. When they returned, she was glowing with triumph. He had such fun, couldn't stop sliding down the playground slide. He even asked for another ice cream. Her laughter filled the room, but Ethan remained silent. His shirt was smudged with dirt, and in his hand he clutched the same red toy car he carried everywhere. "Did you have fun, sweetheart?" I asked gently, kneeling to stroke his hair. He only nodded, avoiding my eyes. The silence spoke louder than any words, and though Vanessa's chatter filled the space, I couldn't quiet the disquiet in my chest. Another day, while preparing lunch, I heard her voice from the living room. At first it was light, then sharper. "Stay still, Ethan. Don't make a mess. You're a big boy now, not a baby." The words carried an edge that made me freeze my knife still against the onion. When I stepped into the room, her tone changed instantly. She smiled, pointing at Ethan's tower of blocks. "Look how clever he is, our little builder." But Ethan's lips were pressed tight, his eyes locked on me with a silent plea. I forced a smile, but the unease twisted deeper inside. Ethan's 7th birthday arrived, and Grace spent the morning baking his favorite chocolate cake. She decorated it with bright frosting and carried it into the room, candles glowing. Ethan's face lit up for the first time in months. "Aunt Grace, this is the best cake ever," he cried, hugging her with pure joy. I watched them with tears in my eyes, grateful for this fragile spark of happiness. Vanessa clapped politely from the corner, her smile brittle. Her only gift was a pat on Ethan's shoulder and a half-hearted happy birthday champ. I saw the way Ethan shrank from her touch, and my heart ached. There were other moments, each one small enough to dismiss, but together forming a chilling pattern. At the grocery store, she scolded Ethan for dropping a bag of candy. "Such a clumsy boy," she hissed, loud enough for Daniel to hear. Daniel frowned and reprimanded his son instead of her, blind to the cruelty in her tone. Ethan lowered his head, his little hands twisting in shame, and looked at me with eyes that begged for understanding. I comforted him as best I could, but the seed of dread grew stronger. Even his teacher began to notice. One afternoon she pulled me aside, her voice hushed but concerned. "Mrs. Harris, Ethan has been quieter than usual. He seems withdrawn. Is something happening at home?" My heart clenched, but I forced a reassuring smile. "He's adjusting to changes. Don't worry." But as we walked home, Ethan tugged on my sleeve. "Grandma," he whispered, "I don't want to go home with Miss Vanessa." I stopped kneeling to meet his eyes. "Why do you say that, my love? She cares for you." Even as I said it, I knew the words were hollow. Ethan shook his head with surprising firmness. "No, Grandma. She doesn't love me." The truth in his gaze shattered me. I stroked his hair, trying to soothe him, but inside I trembled. Grace, walking a few steps behind, heard everything. She said nothing, but I saw her shoulders rise and fall with a heavy sigh. By then I could no longer pretend. Vanessa's mask of sweetness slipped more often, her irritation flashing when she thought no one was looking. Yet in front of Daniel she remained flawless, charming, indispensable. He adored her, blind to the shadows gathering under his own roof. And so piece by piece a silent storm built within our home, waiting for the day it would break. That day came sooner than I ever imagined. The wedding was set in a ballroom flooded with Florida sunlight, golden rays spilling through tall windows. Guests gathered in elegant clothes, the sound of laughter echoing off polished marble. Daniel looked radiant, his suit impeccable, his smile eager. Vanessa gleamed in her gown, the very image of a perfect bride. I sat at table 12, Ethan beside me, Grace on the other side. Ethan pushed his toy car gently across the table, whispering the sound of engines under his breath. Grace leaned over now and then, breaking bread for him, her kindness steady as always. I watched with a fragile sense of comfort. Despite everything, they were the anchor of my soul. The waiters glided between tables, placing appetizers, trays of crackers, dips, and platters of seafood. When a plate of shrimp appeared, Ethan pushed it away with deliberate care. My stomach tightened. I wanted to ask him why, but a relative leaned over, praising his good manners. I forced a smile, but unease prickled. Across the room I saw Vanessa watching. Her smile didn't falter, but for the briefest second her eyes tightened, sharp as glass. I told myself I was imagining it. But then Ethan dropped his toy car. It rolled beneath the table, and when he crouched to pick it up, his face went white. He reached back up with trembling hands, holding a folded slip of paper. His voice quivered as he clung to me. "Grandma, let's go, please." And then came the words that froze my blood, the echo of a nightmare. "You didn't look under the table, did you?" My hands trembled as I unfolded the paper in the dim glow of the candles. The words scrawled across it were short, almost careless, yet they struck like lightning through my veins. Table 12, add shrimp to the child serving. The ballroom spun around me. The clinking of glasses, the chatter of guests, the music of the jazz band, all of it blurred into an indistinct roar. My grandson's life had been marked for danger right here in the middle of a celebration meant for joy. Ethan pressed against me, his small body rigid, his eyes wide with terror. I crumpled the note in my fist and held him tight. Around us people laughed, toasted, posed for photographs, oblivious to the dagger hidden in plain sight. Vanessa's laughter floated across the hall, bright and crystalline, as if she were the queen of this evening. Daniel beamed beside her, glowing with pride. But I could barely breathe. I rose from my chair abruptly, earning surprised glances from nearby guests. I leaned down to Grace and whispered, "Stay with him. Don't let him out of your arms." She nodded, her eyes sharp with understanding. She pulled Ethan closer, wrapping him in her embrace. His small hands clutched her sleeve as though she were his shield. My legs felt like lead as I crossed the ballroom toward the cluster of waiters near the bar. Their laughter was casual, their trays balanced with practiced ease. I singled out a young man named David who had been serving our table earlier. His face was open, friendly, but when I thrust the note before him, his expression changed instantly. "Do you recognize this?" My voice shook, though I forced it to sound steady. David's eyes widened. He swallowed, his hands trembling as he glanced at the paper. "Oh God," he whispered, "that's mine." The words struck me like a slap. My breath caught. "Yours," he shook his head frantically. "Not my handwriting, ma'am, but I was the one carrying it. A woman gave it to me, told me to pass it to the chef. I must have dropped it near your table." His words tumbled out desperate. I didn't know what it said. I swear. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear him. "Who gave it to you?" I demanded, my voice rising sharper than I intended. I don't know her name. She was a guest. Dark hair, wearing a pale dress. She just said it was urgent. His face drained of color as he realized the weight of what he was admitting. I had no idea about any allergy. Fury surged inside me, mixing with terror. I wanted to shake him, to scream. But I saw the panic in his eyes, the truth in his stammering. He was a pawn in someone else's design. Behind me, the MC's voice rang out cheerfully, announcing that the main course would soon be served. The timing was cruel. I clutched the note tighter, my mind racing. If I did nothing, Ethan's plate could arrive poisoned with shrimp. If I hesitated, the trap might spring before anyone noticed. I turned back to the ballroom, the golden lights suddenly harsh, the music mocking. I could see Grace still holding Ethan, her arms wrapped protectively around him. His eyes found mine, full of fear, pleading silently for me to act. I drew a breath, steadying my trembling body. I could not remain silent. Not tonight. The waiters moved gracefully, placing steaming plates before each guest. My pulse thundered as I stepped back toward our table, the crumpled note clutched in my hand like evidence in a trial. I stopped behind my chair, my voice breaking through the chatter with a sharpness that startled even me. "One moment, please." The ballroom fell into a hush. Conversation's stilled forks hovered in midair, and all eyes turned toward me. Grace straightened Ethan, still in her arms. Daniel looked up from across the room, concern flashing across his face. Vanessa's smile faltered, then quickly returned, too smooth, too polished. I held up the note for all to see. "Before anyone eats, I need to ask a question. Who wrote this?" My voice rang with indignation, though inside I shook with dread. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Guests craned their necks, whispering, glancing at each other. Daniel rushed forward, confusion in his eyes. "Mom, what's going on?" I placed the paper on the table, sliding it toward him. "Read it," I said, my voice hoarse. He picked it up, his brow furrowing as his eyes traced the words. His face paled, his hand trembled. "What is this supposed to mean?" He turned to me, bewildered. I met his gaze with all the fury and fear inside me. "It means someone here tried to poison my grandson." Gasps swept through the room. Guests recoiled, shocked murmurs rising like waves in a storm. I heard someone whisper, "Is this a joke?" Another voice, "Surely not at a wedding?" Daniel's face drained of color. He looked at Ethan, then back at me. His mouth opened, but no words came. And then Vanessa approached. Her gown glittered, her smile was tight, and her voice dripped with feigned concern. "What is all this?" she asked softly. "Some kind of prank. A mistake." I caught the flicker in her eyes, a shadow that betrayed her calm mask. My rage burned hotter. "This is no mistake. My grandson is severely allergic to shrimp. One bite could kill him. And this note specifically demanded shrimp be added to his plate." A deadly silence followed. The weight of my words hung heavy in the air, crushing the festive mood beneath it. Vanessa laughed lightly, too lightly. "You're accusing someone based on a scrap of paper. It could be anything. Children imagine things. Perhaps Ethan found a discarded note from the kitchen. Why frighten everyone with wild claims?" Her tone was sweet, but her eyes glittered with steel. I wanted to strike her, to tear away the mask in front of everyone. But before I could speak, Grace stood. She clutched Ethan close, her face pale but resolute. Her voice trembled with fury as she cried, "Enough, Vanessa!" The crack of her hand against Vanessa's cheek echoed through the hall like thunder. Gasps erupted. Glasses rattled. Vanessa reeled back, clutching her face, her eyes wide in disbelief. Daniel froze, caught between shock and confusion. The ballroom was no longer a place of joy. It had become a courtroom, and the trial had just begun. The sound of Grace's hand meeting Vanessa's cheek still reverberated through the hall. It was as though the very air had cracked open. For one frozen second, no one moved. Every guest stared, forks, suspended mouths, agape, the entire ballroom paralyzed in shock. Vanessa's hand flew to her face, her perfect mask trembling at the edges. Her eyes welled with practiced tears as she spun toward Daniel, her voice breaking in just the right places. "You see," she sobbed. "She's jealous. She can't stand to see me happy with you, so she's attacking me in front of everyone. What have I done to deserve this?" Daniel stood between them, his gaze darting from Grace's blazing eyes to Vanessa's tearful performance. His lips moved as if to speak, but no words came. The weight of his confusion pressed visibly on his shoulders. Around us, whispers surged like a tide. She slapped the bride. "Why would she do that? Maybe it's true, maybe the note is real." I slammed my hand down on the table, my voice cutting through the noise. "Enough." The glasses rattled, the silverware clinked, and silence fell once more. My hands shook, but I forced my words to be steady. "This isn't jealousy. This is about my grandson's life. Someone here tried to kill him." Gasps rippled again. Ethan clung to Grace, his little body trembling, his face pressed into her shoulder. Grace's arms tightened around him, her glare fixed on Vanessa like a sword aimed at its target. Vanessa's lips curved into a bitter smile, though her eyes flickered with something darker. "This is madness," she hissed. "You would accuse me on my wedding day without a shred of proof. That paper doesn't even have a name. Anyone could have dropped it." "That's not true," I countered. I turned, scanning the room until I found David, the young waiter. His face was pale as parchment, his eyes wide with fear. "David, come here." He hesitated, then shuffled forward, wringing his hands. I held out the crumpled note. "Tell them what you told me." His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. His voice cracked under the weight of dozens of eyes. "A woman gave it to me," he whispered. "Told me to deliver it to the chef. I didn't know what it said. I dropped it by accident." The room buzzed with fresh murmurs. Vanessa stepped forward, her gown glittering, her tone sharp as a knife. "You're mistaken. I don't know this waiter. I never gave him anything." David shook his head frantically, but before he could speak again, another voice pierced the tension, weak, trembling, but loud enough to carry. It wasn't him who lied. The crowd turned. At a nearby table, a young woman had risen, her face blotched with tears. She was barely 18, her frame slender, her dark hair falling in disarray. Her voice cracked as she spoke again. "It was me. My sister gave me the note." A collective gasp filled the hall. Vanessa's eyes widened in fury. "Gloria, stop." But Gloria's hands shook as tears streamed down her cheeks. "I didn't know what it said," she cried, her voice breaking. "She just told me to hand it to the waiter. I thought it was part of the dinner order. I swear I didn't know it was about Ethan." The room erupted in whispers, louder and harsher this time. Heads turned, eyes locked on Vanessa. Daniel staggered, back his face ashen, his lips trembling. "You lying little girl," Vanessa spat, turning on her sister. Her perfect poise shattered, replaced with raw rage. "How dare you invent such stories to ruin me? You're just jealous like all the rest of them." But Gloria shook her head, her sobs racking her body. "I'm not lying. You asked me to. You said it was important. You said I had to help you. I didn't know, please believe me, I didn't know." Her words hung heavy, undeniable. The crowd's doubt shifted like a tide. Disgust flickered in their eyes. Someone muttered, "On her own wedding day." Another voice whispered, "Trying to harm a child." Vanessa's composure cracked further. Her lips trembled, her hands curled into fists at her sides. "This is a conspiracy," she shrieked. "They're all against me." "Can't you see?" Daniel's voice finally broke through, hoarse and trembling. "Vanessa, is it true?" His eyes searched her face, desperate for denial, for some thread of hope to cling to. Her twisted smile faltered, then returned brittle and thin. "You don't believe them, do you?" she pleaded, reaching for his hand. "It's all lies. They're trying to destroy our wedding. You know me, Daniel. You love me." But his eyes had changed. He pulled his hand back, his chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. He looked at Ethan, clinging to Grace, his little face pale and frightened. The truth was written there, clearer than any words. "I almost lost my son tonight," he whispered. The guests murmured in agreement, some shaking their heads, others glaring openly at Vanessa. One older uncle rose to his feet, his voice quivering with outrage. "Shameful. To even think of harming an innocent child. There's no place for such cruelty among family." Grace's voice cut sharp through the noise. "If you still deny it, then let's check the security cameras. Every hallway, every corner of this ballroom is recorded. The truth will show." A heavy silence fell. Vanessa's face drained of color. Her lips parted, but no sound came. For the first time, her eyes darted in panic, searching for escape. The silence was more damning than any confession. The silence that followed Grace's words was suffocating. The mention of security cameras settled over the ballroom like a hammer waiting to fall. Vanessa's lips moved soundlessly, her eyes darting from one corner of the room to another as though she might find some hidden escape route, but there was none. The evidence was closing in, the truth pressing on all sides. Gloria sobbed quietly at her table, unable to look at anyone. The young waiter David shifted uneasily, clutching his tray like a shield. Guests leaned toward one another, whispering furiously, their expressions a mixture of disgust and disbelief. Daniel stood in the center, caught between the shards of his collapsing world. His hands shook, his eyes glistened. He looked at Vanessa, the woman he had married only hours earlier, the woman he had believed could heal the wounds of his past. He whispered again, his voice raw, "Tell me it's not true." Vanessa forced a laugh, high-pitched and brittle. "Darling, you can't actually believe this circus. Look at them. Look at your mother, your sister, that jealous girl, Grace. They've wanted to tear us apart from the beginning. They're the ones lying, not me." But even as she spoke, her voice cracked. Her hands trembled against the shimmering fabric of her gown. The perfect bride now looked cornered, her mask slipping with every passing second. Daniel shook his head slowly, pain etched deep into his features. "My son could have died." His words rang across the hall like a bell tolling for judgment. Ethan whimpered against Grace's shoulder. She kissed his hair, holding him tighter. The boy's fear was proof enough. No 7-year-old could fabricate terror like that. Vanessa's eyes narrowed, desperation twisting her face. "You don't understand, Daniel. It wasn't like that." "Then what was it like?" I demanded, stepping forward. My voice was trembling but sharp enough to cut glass. "Tell us, Vanessa. Tell us why a note ordering shrimp for a child allergic to it ended up at our table. Tell us why your own sister admitted you gave it to her." Vanessa spun toward me, her expression venomous. "You've hated me from the start," she spat. "You never wanted me to be part of this family. You think no one is good enough after Clara. That's all. This is your bitterness, your jealousy, your need to control Daniel." The accusation stung, but I stood firm. "I may have doubted you, yes, but this," I held up the crumpled note for all to see. "This is not jealousy. This is attempted murder." A collective gasp rose again, but this time it wasn't shock. It was outrage. Guests shifted in their seats, muttering words like unforgivable and monstrous. One woman pressed a hand to her chest, shaking her head. Another man muttered, "How could anyone harm a child?" Vanessa faltered, her eyes flicking nervously to the crowd. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Her silence was louder than any confession. Daniel's chest heaved as he stepped closer, his voice low and broken. "I let you into my life, into my son's life. And this is what you do. You try to kill him." Tears streaked Vanessa's cheeks. They might have been convincing once, but now they looked hollow, the last performance of a crumbling actress. She reached for Daniel's hand, but he pulled away. The gesture crushed her. "You don't believe me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel closed his eyes, his jaw clenched. "I can't." Her face twisted with fury. "You're all against me, every one of you," her scream echoed shrill and desperate. "You've poisoned him against me, filled his head with lies. You think you're so noble, but you're nothing. Nothing." The guests recoiled at her outburst. Whatever sympathy might have remained evaporated in that instant. Grace stepped forward, her voice calm but sharp. "Look at Ethan. Look at his fear. He's the one who exposed you. He's the one you wanted to silence. Are you calling him a liar too?" Vanessa's gaze flicked to the boy, trembling in Grace's arms. For a second, her expression hardened, her lips pressed into a thin line. That was enough. That single flicker of contempt toward an innocent child sealed her fate. A low murmur swelled into a chorus of disapproval. "Disgraceful, evil. She doesn't deserve him." One of Daniel's uncles rose, his fists clenched, his face red with fury. "This woman should be thrown out this instant. She doesn't belong here." The security staff, alerted by the escalating chaos, approached cautiously. One man in a black suit spoke firmly. "Ma'am, we'll have to ask you to leave." Vanessa's eyes widened, wild with disbelief. "Leave. This is my wedding." She clutched at her gown as though it might anchor her to the room. "You can't make me leave." But no one came to her defense, not a single guest. Even Gloria sat, frozen tears streaming down her cheeks, unable to raise her head. Daniel lowered his face into his hands. His shoulders shook, his voice breaking as he whispered, "How could I have been so blind?" I touched his arm gently, my own throat tight with grief. "Love makes us blind, son. But at least tonight the truth was revealed before it was too late." He looked at Ethan, still clinging to Grace, and fresh tears filled his eyes. He knelt before his son, his voice hoarse. "I'm so sorry, Ethan. I should have protected you." His tears fell onto the polished floor, each one a testament to the guilt that would haunt him. The ballroom, once filled with joy and music, had turned into a courtroom of condemnation. Vanessa stood alone, her glittering gown suddenly a costume stripped of meaning. The security staff stepped closer, guiding her toward the doors. She fought, shaking her head, shouting through her tears, "You'll regret this, all of you. You'll see, I was the best thing that ever happened to this family." But her words fell into the abyss of contempt surrounding her. Guests averted their eyes, some whispering prayers, others muttering curses. When the doors finally closed behind, her silence settled over the room, heavy and suffocating. The celebration was gone. All that remained was grief, betrayal, and the fragile relief that Ethan was still alive. I gathered my grandson into my arms, pressing him close, feeling the fragile beat of his heart against my chest. "It's over," I whispered into his hair. "She can't hurt you anymore." But even as I said it, I knew the wounds she had left would linger far longer than the night itself. The morning after the wedding felt like waking into a nightmare that refused to end. The house was silent, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, his face buried in his hands. The sunlight streaming through the blinds painted pale stripes across his hunched shoulders, but he looked like a man swallowed by darkness. I brewed coffee, though neither of us drank much. The steam rose, carrying a bitterness that seemed to echo the air between us. He hadn't slept. His eyes were red and swollen, his voice hoarse when he finally spoke. "I brought her into our lives," he said, the words heavy as stones. "I invited her into Ethan's world. And she could have killed him." His hands trembled as he pressed them against his forehead. "What kind of father does that make me?" I wanted to tell him he wasn't to blame, that he had been deceived by Vanessa's charm, but the words felt fragile against his grief. Instead, I placed my hand over his and whispered, "It makes you human. Humans want to believe in love. You've already lost so much, Clara, the years of her laughter and warmth. Of course you wanted to believe someone could fill that emptiness." His shoulders shook. For a moment he looked like a boy again, not a grown man, but my son, in need of comfort. "I failed him, Mom," he whispered. "I failed Ethan." Before I could answer, small footsteps padded into the kitchen. Ethan stood in the doorway, clutching his toy car, his hair mussed from sleep. His eyes darted to his father, then to me. His voice was soft, almost a whisper. Daddy Daniel looked up, his face breaking. He reached for his son, pulling him into his lap. Ethan nestled against him cautiously, as though testing whether it was safe. Daniel held him tightly, tears dripping onto the boy's hair. "I'm so sorry, Ethan," he choked out. "I should have protected you." Ethan pressed his cheek against his father's chest, silent for a moment. Then, in a voice barely audible, he said, "I just want Mommy back." The words sliced through the room like a blade. Daniel froze, his body trembling. He closed his eyes, gripping his son even tighter, as though he could anchor himself against the unbearable truth. Clara was gone, and no one could replace her. Later that day, Grace arrived. She moved quietly through the house, tidying dishes, folding laundry, easing into the gaps left by grief. She found Ethan in the living room, sitting cross-legged on the rug with his toy cars lined neatly in a row. She sat beside him, her smile gentle. "Want to build a racetrack?" she asked. His eyes brightened for the first time in days. He nodded, pushing one car into her hand. They spent the afternoon constructing elaborate roads with books and pillows, their laughter filling corners of the house that had been silent too long. I watched from the kitchen doorway, my chest swelling with gratitude. Grace had always been a quiet force, but now she became a light we desperately needed. Ethan clung to her, seeking comfort in her presence. Daniel noticed too. He lingered in the doorway, watching them with a mix of sorrow and something else, something that hinted at a possibility he wasn't ready to name. The days that followed blurred together. News of the wedding scandal spread quickly through the family. Whispers circled like vultures, phone calls rang at odd hours, relatives asked questions we didn't want to answer. Some pitied us, others judged silently, but none could understand the depth of the wound Vanessa had left. Daniel avoided them all. He buried himself in work again, but it no longer carried the same purpose. It was a shield, thin and cracking. At night I heard him pacing in his room, his footsteps restless. Sometimes he sat at the kitchen table long after midnight, staring into an empty cup. Ethan grew clingier, reluctant to leave the house. At school he stayed close to his teacher, wary of strangers. I spoke often with her, reassuring her that he was safe, that we were trying. But each night, he asked me to check under his bed to make sure no one was hiding. His innocence had been fractured, and no lullaby could restore it. Grace, however, refused to let the darkness consume him. She spent evenings reading him stories, her voice patient and soothing. She taught him how to paint with watercolors, his little hands smearing blue across paper as he laughed again. Slowly, cautiously, Ethan began to heal. One evening, as the sun dipped low, I sat with Daniel on the porch. The air smelled of rain, the garden damp from an afternoon storm. We watched Grace and Ethan chase fireflies across the yard, their laughter floating toward us. "She's good for him," Daniel said quietly. I nodded. "She's good for both of you." He didn't respond, but I saw the way his eyes lingered on Grace. There was admiration there, gratitude, and perhaps something deeper he wasn't ready to admit. "Do you ever think," he asked after a long pause, "that Clara would want me to find happiness again?" The question hung heavy in the air. I thought of Clara's warm smile, the way she loved so fiercely. "I think Clara would want you to be loved," I answered softly, "but not at the cost of your son's safety, not with someone who brings poison into your life." Daniel's jaw tightened and he nodded. He knew I was right. He knew Vanessa had been a hollow replacement, a mirage born of loneliness. And though the wound she left would take time to close, perhaps there was hope still glimmering in the distance. That night, when Ethan fell asleep clutching his toy car, Grace tucked him in with a tenderness that filled the room with quiet peace. She kissed his forehead and whispered, "You're safe now. Always safe." For the first time since the wedding, I allowed myself to believe her words. Weeks passed, but the shadow of that night lingered like a stain that refused to fade. Though Vanessa was gone, her presence haunted the corners of the house. The gown she had worn still hung in photographs. Daniel had not yet taken down the whispers of scandal, still clung to phone calls and passing neighbors. But inside our walls we tried to stitch together what had been torn apart. Ethan was the most fragile thread. He still flinched at sudden noises, still pressed himself against me or Grace whenever strangers came to the door. He refused to eat anything he hadn't seen prepared with his own eyes. Once, when Daniel offered him shrimp at a company dinner out of habit, Ethan burst into tears so violently that the entire restaurant turned to stare. Daniel's face crumpled in shame. He held his son, whispering apologies, but the damage was already there. At home, though, healing began in the smallest of ways. Grace was the architect of that healing. She invented games that made Ethan laugh again, turning the living room into a racetrack with pillows and blankets. She taught him to bake cookies, letting him crack the eggs and stir the batter while he wore one of her aprons that hung nearly to his feet. His giggles returned, timid at first, then brighter each day. I often found myself standing in the doorway watching them together. Grace's patience never faltered. When Ethan made a mess, she laughed instead of scolding. When he grew frustrated with a puzzle, she guided him gently, praising his effort rather than his success. She became the constant I once feared he would never have again after Clara's death. Daniel noticed too, though he tried not to show it. He worked late, but when he came home he lingered longer in the doorway watching Grace and Ethan with a look that mixed gratitude and longing. His grief still clung to him like a heavy coat, but when he saw them together a spark of hope flickered in his eyes. One Saturday afternoon we decided to spend the day at the park. The Florida sun was warm, the air thick with the scent of blooming jasmine. Children's laughter floated across the playground. Ethan ran ahead, his toy car clutched in one hand as he made race car sounds weaving between benches. Grace followed him, her sundress catching the breeze, her laughter ringing like a bell. She pushed him on the swings higher and higher until his squeals of delight filled the air. Daniel sat beside me on the bench, his hands folded, his gaze fixed on them. He hasn't laughed like that in years, he murmured, his voice thick. Grace has a gift, I said. She understands him. Daniel nodded slowly. She's remarkable. His words carried more weight than he intended, and when he realized it, he looked away, his cheeks coloring. I said nothing, but inside I wondered if perhaps Clara had sent Grace to us for this very reason, to mend what had been broken, to bring warmth where coldness threatened to settle permanently. That evening, as we returned home, Ethan was drowsy from the sun and play. Grace carried him upstairs, tucking him into bed with gentle hands. I overheard her whisper, "Sweet dreams, champ," before brushing a kiss across his forehead. Ethan stirred, murmuring, "Don't go, Aunt Grace." "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered back. Daniel lingered outside the bedroom door, listening. His hand rested against the frame, his face unreadable. Later that night he sat with me in the kitchen, his eyes clouded. "Do you think I'll ever be enough for him?" he asked suddenly. "After everything I failed him with Vanessa. I couldn't protect Clara. And now, he looks at Grace the way he used to look at his mother. What if he loves her more than he loves me?" I reached across the table, taking his hand. "He doesn't love her more. He loves her differently. Grace gives him comfort, safety. You're his father. He needs you in ways no one else can replace. But you can't shut her out, Daniel. Maybe she's the bridge between you and him, the one who helps you find each other again." Daniel's jaw tightened. He said nothing, but his eyes shimmered with tears he wouldn't let fall. The following week, Ethan's school hosted a small play. He had a minor role as a tree, but to him it was monumental. Grace spent hours helping him paint cardboard leaves, attaching them to his costume with string. On the night of the performance, when Ethan spotted us in the crowd, me, Grace, and Daniel sitting together, his face lit up like the Sunday. He waved furiously, his cardboard leaves shaking with the motion. Daniel waved back, a wide smile breaking across his face. In that moment, for the first time in years, I saw my son look genuinely happy. After the play, Ethan ran into Grace's arms, babbling excitedly about how he remembered all his lines. She laughed and spun him around, her joy infectious. Daniel watched them, his expression tender, though sorrow still lingered at the edges. Later, as we walked to the car, Ethan slipped his small hand into Daniel's. "Did I do good, Daddy?" he asked softly. Daniel crouched down, his voice thick. "You did amazing, son. I'm so proud of you." He hugged Ethan tightly, and the boy clung to him without hesitation. For Daniel, it was a step toward healing. For Ethan, it was proof that his father was still there, still fighting for him. That night, as I tucked myself into bed, I thought of Clara. I imagined her watching from somewhere beyond, her heart aching with love for the son and grandson she'd left behind. Perhaps she too would have smiled at the sight of Grace filling the spaces that once seemed impossible to fill. The scars Vanessa left were deep, but the threads of healing had begun to weave. And though the road ahead would not be easy, I could feel it. We were no longer standing in the ruins. We were building again. Autumn crept into Florida subtly, the way it always did, less by the changing color of leaves and more by the cooling of evenings, the softer light slanting across the yard. Our house settled into a fragile rhythm. The chaos of the wedding had passed, but its echoes remained like faint cracks in plaster no paint could hide. Daniel spent more evenings at home now. He still worked long hours, but instead of disappearing behind his office door, when he returned, he lingered. He sat with Ethan while he did homework, asked him questions about his day, and sometimes even laughed at his stories. At first, Ethan was hesitant, wary of this sudden closeness, but slowly he warmed. The distance between father and son narrowed inch by cautious inch. One night after Grace had tucked Ethan into bed, Daniel joined me on the porch. The air was cool, the sky scattered with stars. He leaned against the railing, his face shadowed, his voice low. "Do you ever think Clara would forgive me?" he asked suddenly. The question pulled at my heart. I turned toward him. "Forgive you for what? For failing her? For not being there when she needed me most? For letting Ethan grow up without her, then bringing her?" He spat the word like poison into our lives. His shoulders sagged. I keep replaying it in my head. The accident, the wedding, all the ways I wasn't enough. I placed my hand on his arm firm. "Daniel, grief doesn't mean failure. Clara's death wasn't your fault. And Vanessa, she deceived all of us, not just you. You can't carry all the blame." His eyes glistened in the starlight. "But Ethan looks at me, and sometimes I see it, the doubt, The fear. I don't ever want him to wonder if I can protect him again. You're protecting him now, I said gently. Every time you choose to be here, every time you show up, you're proving it. He turned his gaze back to the yard where the fireflies flickered. Grace proves it more than I do. The truth of that statement hung heavy between us. Grace was no longer just a presence in our home. She was the glue holding us together. She guided Ethan's healing with patience, steadied my faltering spirit, and reminded Daniel of what love looked like without cruelty. The next morning I found Grace in the kitchen with Ethan. They were making pancakes, flour dusting their hands, laughter bubbling between them. Ethan wore an apron twice his size, his face smeared with batter. Grace flipped a pancake onto his plate and he grinned as though she'd performed a magic trick. "Best chef in the world," Ethan declared. Grace laughed, ruffling his hair. "That's you, not me." Daniel leaned in the doorway, watching them with a look so soft it startled me. For the first time, his grief seemed to loosen its grip. He stepped forward, kissed Ethan's forehead, and whispered, "Save one for me, champ." Ethan's eyes lit up at the word champ, the same word Clara used to use. Daniel caught my gaze, and for once he didn't flinch. He was trying. Weeks later, Ethan came home from school with a crumpled piece of paper in his backpack. It was a drawing, 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a crooked sundae. One had long hair, one had a tie, and one had a toy car. Above them, in shaky letters, he'd written family. When I showed it to Daniel, his eyes filled with tears. "He drew Grace," he whispered. "He sees her as part of us." I nodded, because she is. That night, after Ethan was asleep, Daniel found Grace in the living room sorting through school papers. He sat across from her, his expression uncertain. "Grace," he began, "I don't say this enough, but thank you. For everything you've done for Ethan, for all of us." She looked up startled, then smiled gently. "You don't need to thank me. He's family. Your family. I'd do anything for him." Her sincerity shook him. He leaned forward, his voice unsteady. "You've given him more than I could, more than I ever imagined anyone could after Clara." His words faltered, but the weight of them lingered. Grace's cheeks flushed. She lowered her gaze, busying herself with the papers, but her silence was louder than words. I watched from the hallway unseen, my heart caught between sorrow for what was lost and hope for what might be found. As the holidays approached, we decorated the house together. Ethan insisted on placing the star on top of the tree, and Daniel lifted him onto his shoulders, steadying him as he reached. Grace clapped and cheered, and Ethan beamed with pride. For the first time in years, the house felt alive again, glowing with more than just twinkling lights. On Christmas morning, Ethan tore open a gift from Grace, a new set of toy cars. His eyes sparkled, and he threw his arms around her neck. "You always know what I like," he said, his voice full of pure affection. Daniel watched them, his eyes misting, his smile bittersweet. Later, as the fire crackled and Ethan dozed against Grace's shoulder, Daniel whispered to me, "Maybe she's the miracle we didn't know we needed." I nodded, tears stinging my eyes. Maybe she is, but miracles are fragile things. And though hope glimmered in our home once more, I couldn't help but wonder, would Daniel have the courage to embrace it fully, or would the weight of his guilt keep him chained to the past? The answer I knew would shape not just his life, but Ethan's as well. The new year arrived quietly. No fireworks, no champagne, no crowded gatherings. Just the 3 of us and Grace sitting together in the living room, the faint glow of the Christmas tree still flickering in the corner. Ethan curled on the couch between us, his toy car rolling lazily across the cushions. The world outside was hushed, but inside I felt something stir, something like renewal. Daniel had been changing. The walls he'd built around his grief, around his guilt, were slowly crumbling. He came home earlier, set aside his phone during dinner, listened when Ethan chattered about school. He laughed more, even if the laughter still carried a trace of sadness. And he looked at Grace differently now. Less like a helper, more like a companion, someone whose presence steadied him in ways he hadn't realized he needed. One evening after Ethan had gone to bed, Daniel asked Grace to walk with him. They stepped out into the cool night air, the garden fragrant with damp earth. I watched them from the window as they paced slowly along the path, their breath visible in the chill. "Grace," I heard him say, his voice low but steady, "I don't know if I deserve another chance at happiness. But if I do, it's because of you." She stopped, turning to face him. Daniel, he lifted a hand, trembling. You've been more than a sister, more than a guardian. You've been a mother to Ethan when he needed one most. And he broke off, shaking his head. I'm afraid. Afraid of betraying Clara's memory. Afraid of asking too much from you. Grace's eyes glistened. She took a step closer, her voice soft but firm. Loving Clara doesn't mean you can't love again. And as for asking too much, I'd give everything for Ethan. For you. Because this family saved me too, Daniel. You gave me a home when I had none. Don't think I've forgotten that. For a moment the air between them was charged, fragile. Then Daniel reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. I turned from the window, tears filling my eyes. Clara's absence would always ache, but perhaps she would have wanted this for her son, to find comfort for her child, to be loved, for her family to keep living instead of crumbling into sorrow. The weeks that followed confirmed it. Grace became not just Ethan's safe harbor, but Daniel's as well. Their bond deepened, built not on pretense or performance like Vanessa's had been, but on patience, sacrifice, and quiet devotion. Ethan noticed one night while Grace read him a bedtime story, he looked up at her and asked, "Will you always be here?" Grace hesitated, her eyes flicking to me where I stood in the doorway. Then she smiled and brushed his hair back. "Always," she whispered. Ethan grinned, satisfied. For the first time since Clara's death, he went to sleep without asking if someone was hiding under his bed. Daniel, too, began to shed his guilt. He visited Clara's grave one Sunday morning, bringing Ethan and Grace with him. The sky was clear, the grass damp with dew. He knelt, placing a bouquet of lilies at the headstone, his hands shaking as he whispered, "I'll never forget you. I'll always love you. But I need to learn to live again for him." He looked at Ethan, then at Grace. "For all of us." I placed a hand on his shoulder, my heart aching and swelling all at once. In that moment I felt Clara's spirit linger, not in sorrow but in quiet approval. Life didn't magically become perfect. There were still whispers in the community about the scandal. There were nights Ethan woke crying from nightmares, and mornings Daniel stared too long at old photographs. But there was also laughter again, the sound of Ethan racing toy cars across the kitchen floor, the warmth of Grace humming while she cooked, the rare but growing ease in Daniel's smile. One evening, as we sat down to dinner, Ethan looked around the table at his father, at Grace, at me, and said, with the blunt honesty only a child could muster, "We're happy now." The words silenced us for a moment. Daniel reached across the table, squeezing Grace's hand. She met his gaze, her eyes shining, and I, my heart swelling, realized the boy was right. We had walked through fire, through loss, betrayal, and nearly unforgivable mistakes, but somehow we had come out the other side. Scarred, yes, but still standing, and more than that, still capable of love. As I watched Ethan laugh that night, his toy car zooming between the plates, I whispered a silent promise to Clara. "He's safe now. He's loved. We'll carry him forward just as you would have wanted." And for the first time in what felt like forever, I believed it.